Americans moved around a lot over the past 2 years.
Many have generally gone either south or west.
And those destinations also happen to have the highest inflation rates in the US.
The story of inflation is more a story about hotbed migration destinations and how that changed during the pandemic.
Phoenix, Atlanta, and Tampa are among the metro regions seeing both hot inflation and the pandemic surge of home buying.
The reason why Atlanta is one of the hotspots in terms of inflation in the country is because people are moving into Atlanta.
2 or 3 times a week we get phone calls, people wanting to buy our house for cash, complete strangers.
We saw right away that inflation was highest in Phoenix and lowest in San Francisco.
Nationally, the Consumer Price Index rose by 8.3% in April 2022.
They're effectively becoming poorer as prices rise.
Now, once you get here, you find, wow, this inflation is so high compared to where they moved from.
It's important as ever to pay attention to how migration is impacting things like inflation.
Here's where inflation is burning red hot and how migration across the country affected it. Many Americans relocated from expensive coastal cities to more affordable urban areas, according to the real estate broker Redfin. However, this kind of inflation migration trend seems new.
2021, where we started to see an acceleration of migration driven by the pandemic into these hot places like Tampa and Phoenix and Atlanta, where we really started to see the relationship expand and pull out, where the hot migration destinations are driving the big increases in inflation.
According to Redfin's analysis, Phoenix has the highest inflation rate of any U.S. metro area. Prices spiked 10.9% in the first quarter of 2022. Plus, Phoenix was one of the most popular places to move to, second only to beachy Miami, Florida, according to Redfin.
Housing is definitely a large component that is driving that. Housing costs in Phoenix as of the first quarter are about 12% growth right now.
Most people in Phoenix that are homeowners are watching the home price inflation with a great deal of enjoyment. Essentially, home prices are darn near doubled what they were 2 or 3 years ago.
Hot housing market like Atlanta's.
We have a lot of people moving in. That's definitely increased the demand for goods and services, and especially housing.
Redfin said Atlanta had the second highest inflation rate at 10.6%. And the Georgia metropolis also happened to be the 10th most popular migration destination.
People have more work flexibility, and they are also looking for more affordable places compared to San Francisco, New York, and all the other bigger metropolitan area. Atlanta is still much more affordable. That margin is definitely shrinking.
The Sun Belt trend continues, with Tampa, Florida having the third highest inflation rate at 9.9% and as being the third most popular migration destination. Meanwhile, the city that saw the most people moving away was San Francisco. And San Francisco had the lowest inflation rate in Redfin's analysis at 5.2%.
We know a lot of people that we've been tracking during the pandemic have been leaving places like the Bay Area and been moving and pouring into these hot migration destinations throughout the pandemic.
The New York City area had the second lowest inflation rate at 5.4% and saw the third most migration away.
And keep in mind, this is price change, not price level. So we're not saying it's less expensive to live in New York. It's just that their current inflation rate's a little bit lower.
Measure inflation as the percentage change of the price index, the consumer price index. So that is a basket of representative goods that people consume, and housing accounts for 1/3 of that basket.
The Consumer Price Index, the CPI, is a measure of the average change over time in the prices paid by consumers, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That basket of stuff is developed from information provided by families and individuals on what they actually bought. But the prices calculated from each item in the basket are weighted.
And we have a sample of all sorts of goods and services that we collect data from every month. About 75 areas across the country we're collecting in the neighborhood of 80,000 prices a month, so around $1 million per year. And we're using that to compute both, overall price change, how much the price has risen for that whole market basket.
So if the CPI represents the average weighted prices of goods across the country, regional CPI measures have their own unique weighted baskets of prices, just slightly different weights. And that variation depends on the region.
Can be different from place to place. Now, our data shows that there's substantial inflation in every area of the country, a little bit less in the Northeast, a little bit more in the South and West. The first place to look is sort of the weight of gasoline and also just the shelter or rental costs, because that's where we see the most variation.
In the most recent 12-month period, gas prices in Phoenix are up over 40%. People buy a lot of cars. Some people buy used cars. Prices of both of those have really increased nationally, but also here in Phoenix, that's been a big driver.
People feel the pain at the pump. The gas price increase, that will increase the cost of many other things. And you can see the food price and overall other services. So that definitely affects the cost of living.
Even though the national housing market is showing signs of a cool down, Phoenix, Tampa, and Atlanta will remain attractive to out-of-town homebuyers, according to Redfin, thanks in part to pandemic-fueled remote work.
I think there's a long-term migration in the U.S. towards sort of the Sun Belt, towards the South and West, away from the Northeast, and it's probably continuing.
Homes are becoming less affordable more quickly in the Sun Belt metros than in coastal areas.
Does that affect migration? I don't know. It hadn't seemed to as of this point because prices have gone up everywhere.
Big factor that will drive both inflation and migration pattern is the housing market. The rate hike now the Fed is conducting. We know, right, when the mortgage rate is higher, it will cool down the housing market a little bit, right? But specifically how the Atlanta housing market will move, that is hard to say.
Redfin suggests that the financial benefits of moving to relatively affordable areas may eventually diminish.
The cost of living might be really affordable to someone who's moving into the area, but for an existing resident who is already there, they might be feeling more of the pains if they haven't had as strong income gains and they are still facing higher prices.
That's why wages are the key component that ties this together, especially for locals.
Locals are simply priced out and they have to either move much further out or to a place like Dallas instead, where it's relatively more affordable.
As your wage and your salary cannot increase and keep up with the pace of inflation, your purchasing power will be hurt.
Wage increases nationally were 5%. Phoenix wages were up 6.4%. Now that's, of course, not really keeping up with inflation.
People will be hurt a lot more.
And that is more pronounced and more of an issue in these hot migration destinations. What do we need to do to address that? Raising interest rates that the Fed is going to continue to do will be one way to mitigate inflation and to tame it. That's one strategy. Another strategy shows up with this analysis that we need to build more homes in these hot migration areas to add housing supply to also ease the burden of renters and that are experiencing growth in their rents. There's also transportation infrastructure that people can invest in and maybe ease the burden of relying on cars in these very car-dependent metro areas like Atlanta and Phoenix that are experiencing really high growth.
There's a lot of uncertainty in the economy about what is next. You have the issues related to labor availability, labor shortages. When you have that kind of churn in the labor market, it puts upward pressure on wages. So what is the big unknown, of course, is the several unknowns really, but the effect of Federal Reserve policy, is it going to be a soft landing? Is it going to be a catastrophe? Who knows?